Hi and welcome to this video dedicated to a new Photoshop plugin from the MindtheColor family, again written by Carlo Diamanti. MindtheColor Density. The reason behind this name? Well, it's simple. For the first time, it's possible to manipulate color density inside Photoshop. Now, some people may ask, what does density mean and what does it have to do with color? Well, it's important to clarify right away that we are not talking about density related to the CMYK printing inks, but rather to the RGB color mode. Now, those who typically use the tools available in RGB inside Photoshop are used of thinking of color in terms of hue, saturation and brightness, or tonal range. For tonal range, for example, we can use many tools such as curves or others more or less advanced. For color, we can use tools that can adjust the hue, saturation and brightness, but they always work by using an additive kind of correction that changes the brightness of the image in a certain way. The concept of density in RGB, on the other side, is completely different because it comes from subtractive correction, typical of the film world, specifically cinematic film. It's no coincidence that professionals using color correction and color grading software for cinema already know what I'm talking about, because they are familiar with the difference between additive and subtractive correction. As we will see, this radically changes the way we approach color correction, as it requires a completely different approach to working with images. But let's jump straight into an example to understand this much better. I would like to start with a simple test image. This can be downloaded from the ARRI website and is a very common test image that can be used normally is used for testing cinema cameras. I can enhance the saturation of this image, so I'm gonna take a hue saturation adjustment layer, and you can see that when I increase the saturation, what I have is something like this. Okay. Now, of course, I have the global saturation, but when I increase this kind of saturation, I have only certain kind of colors that can be more saturated. Of course, if I have to work on the saturation and the colors of the image, I would like to have some instruments for checking the colors. And here in the Utility tab, I have the vector scope that I can use also in a separate way. So I can click here on the external button, and then I can use this tool in real time by clicking here, Live Update. So I can check the result before and after. You can see how the saturation is working. Now, let me open the MindtheColor Density panel. And as you can see, it's a very, very simple panel. The first thing I would like to note is that we don't have a global saturation command, but we have only separate colors commands. For example, we have a red, green, blue, yellow, cyan and magenta. And then we have an option for the skin tone. So the basic idea of this panel is to work on every color separately in terms of saturation and density. Let me turn off this, and here we have what kind of colors we have. Of course, we have a skin tone, so I would like to increase the saturation, and you can see how different is the kind of saturation we get. For example, if I push this at the maximum, you can see how far I can go, but you can see how different is this. For understanding what's going on, we must switch to the parade. That is a separate instrument here that can be useful because the parade can show us what's going on inside the RGB channel. I'm gonna move this back here, for example, like this. Let's take a look at the parade. So here is the MindtheColor Density, and here is the hue saturation command. I'm increasing the global saturation, so I can go back here and then I can sample the skin tone and increase the saturation. If I push this all the way to the right, you can see how different is this. And you can see also why is different, because the kind of signal I have inside the RGB channel is very different from the density command that I have here. You can see how the density, how the weight of the image is changing. And here comes the concept of working in a subtractive correction instead of an additive correction. I can increase also the density, and what I will get is that all the skin tone will darken, so I can go back with the saturation, and that's before and that's after. Now, this is pretty impossible with the normal use saturation command, because if I go here and I go into the reds and I try to darken the reds, what I will get is actually a desaturation of the reds, and this is very different. And here comes, of course, this kind of command that is very old and is inside Photoshop from the beginning. So I'm gonna switch back here, and I can move, for example, I'm gonna okay, so I'm gonna switch back here, and then I can move on the greens. Okay, I can try, you can see how it's darkening, and if I also increase the saturation, you can see how much weight I can give to the sweater of the girl. So I'm gonna maybe try to reduce here, and that's before and that's after. Now, moving on a different image, I would like to open this raw file coming from Andrea Burla, and normally I would work on this kind of file working on the tonal range and optimizing the tonal range, but I would like to show a different approach here. So it's clear that we have an issue here in the highlights, so the only thing I would like to do here is to fix this issue in the highlights. So I'm gonna bring down the highlights and the whites only. I can do much more, but I would like to go inside Photoshop and try MindtheColor density. Of course, for working on this kind of image, I must try to guess what kind of colors we have inside this image. So, for example, here we have oranges, we have yellows, we have reds. So I'm going to switch here on the skin tone that are a kind of orange, and I would like to increase the saturation and see what happens. Okay, this is too far, I guess. Yes. And then move the density command, maybe a little bit less, and that's before and that's after. And then move on the other colors. For example, here we have for sure something like blue, I guess. Let me switch here to the vector scope. Yes, we have a kind of blue, something between the cyan and the blue. So I'm gonna switch to the blue and increase the saturation of the blue. And you can see how much detail I have here. And now I can increase the density. Maybe the blues are moving too much towards the purple. So I'm gonna come here and move the U command, and then I can increase this. Then I can switch on the cyan and try to see what happens. And again, try to increase the density. And then of course I have a kind of green here. So I'm gonna move here and try to increase the density. And you can see how much detail I can add to this image. Of course, here in the sky now the effect is too strong, and I can use this option here, that is the recovery control, and try to recover the highlights. And then go back here and go back here in the highlights and try to, for example, to decrease the saturation. And that's before and that's after. And you can see how much detail I have inside this image with this kind of correction. Now you're touching the real power of subtractive correction that can give you a lot of detail, a lot of weight to the image. Before doing this, it was clear that this image was missing something on the tonal range and of course on the colors, but now maybe this is too much, of course, but you can see how this image has completely changed. And this is the same kind of approach that we can use on different images. On this one, for example, it's clear that we have two different kind of colors. We have warm colors and cold colors. So I'm gonna go on the skin command that is more or less something like an orange, and I try to increase the saturation. You can see that when I increase the saturation, how much weight is added to the image. And of course I can work here on the blues. So this is saturation, this is density, and then I can move on the cyan. I can try the reds as well. Maybe this is too much. Yes, of course this is too much. And that's before and that's after. Now this image is quite different from the previous one, because this is supposed to be a retouched, a worked image, but you can see how much we can work on an image that was supposed to be, you know, worked, retouched or so. And moving on a different kind of image where we have orange, yellow and something like green or red. Now, for example, I can go here like the previous one and increase the saturation and then the density. Okay, this is definitely too much. And I can try to see if I increase the saturation of the greens, for example, and the weight of the greens. Okay, I'm gonna try to move the hue just a little bit. So that's before and that's after. So I can go back here and increase the saturation of the orange and try to do something on the reds as well. Okay, now I can work in a different way. I can also decrease the density here. And I can go back on the saturation. And you can see that's before and that's after. Now, I don't think this kind of result can be achieved with the usual commands inside Photoshop, because this kind of results can be achieved only with the subtractive correction, not with the additive correction. And talking about subtractive corrections, here we have the opposite case, in which we don't have so much contrast, a very large tonal range. In fact, if I click here on the waveform, you can see that I have no whites, no blacks, so I have a very small contrast. Now, let's have a look on what we can do here for increasing the weight of the image. This is something I would like to fix usually with the curves, but I can move, for example, the density command, and you can see that the image is gaining a lot of weight. So I can go here in the yellows and do the same. Wow, that's before and that's after. I can switch to the reds and try to increase the reds. Wow, this is too much, definitely. And also I can move here on the greens, try to increase this, and I can move the hue more or less like this. Now, of course, that's before and that's after. This is completely different, but I can use also the recovery command to limit the effect in the highlights. That's before and that's after. And you can see how pleasant is the effect of this kind of command. I can also reduce the width of the effect on the yellows and on the oranges, and now that's before and that's after. You can see how powerful is this kind of correction. Even in an image like this, dominated by one single kind of colors, we can get very interesting results. For example, what happens here, we have for sure yellows, oranges, and maybe something like reds. So I'm gonna go here and try to increase the density. You can see how it's changing. And now I can move on the saturation, and you can see that I'm getting a very strong saturation, but also a lot of weight. Now, moving on to reds, I would like to push this even further and try to do this. Now, this is kind of dramatic, and you can see what I get. This is a very saturated image, but doesn't look oversaturated, because a subtractive saturation always add some weight to the image. Now, maybe talking about density and weight, this is too much. Let me increase this. Now, what happens if I try to work on the tonal range separately? So I'm gonna come here and use a curves adjustment layer and try to change the tonal range of the image. Okay, this looks interesting. So before and after, maybe not so much. But now, that's before and that's after. You can see how this kind of correction works, and also which kind of approach we must have if we want to correct an image in this way. And even in images like this, where we have a very strong contrast, we have a tonal range, a very wide tonal range, I can work on saturation and see what happens. So, for example, we have, of course, here also we have reds and oranges. Okay, now this looks very interesting. And then moving on to oranges, I can do this. And what happens if I try to increase? Oh, this is very interesting. Maybe add some density. Okay, now it looks, of course, too much, but I can use again a curves layer and try to work on the tonal range. And now it looks much better. So that's my before and that's after. And you can see how different results we can get by working in a subtractive mode. And here we are working in additive mode because we are adding some light to the image. But again, before and after, I think this is a very interesting result. Now moving on a different kind of subject, here for example we have some stills taken from a video. We must understand what kind of colors we have before working on an image with MindtheColor density. Of course, here the tonal range is, I would say, shifted towards the highlights. We have a very strong highlights, but we can try to guess. Maybe here in the sky, of course, we will have a kind of cyan. So I'm gonna go here to the cyan and try to increase the saturation. Okay, nothing is changing so much. So I'm gonna move here to the density and try to increase the density. And then I'm gonna switch on the blue and try to increase the saturation of the blues. Now something is really happening. And this is how much I can get in the highlights, moving the density of the blues. And that's before and that's after. Of course, I have some problems here in the flowers, but this is something I can fix very, very quickly with a very large brush, maybe 30–40%. And painting with black on the adjustment layer mask. And then I can continue to work on this image. For example, here on the greens. Oh no, let me check what kind of blue I have, because I see here maybe just a little bit. Okay, shift the hue. Okay, now I think it's better. Now let's move on to greens. Of course, I'm going to increase the saturation here for giving some weight. Now that's very good. Maybe I am going to move this towards the green. Okay. And then I'm going to try to work on the skin. Try to increase the saturation. Of course, this is pretty difficult to work on. No, I would like to leave the density as it is. And now I can try to use the recovery slider on the highlights. And that's it. So this is before and this is after. Now, the very interesting thing about this kind of corrections is that usually you don't know how far you can go with this kind of correction, because sometimes the results are unexpected. Now, talking about frames taken from a video, I have another frame taken from the same video, so I'm going to open this and try to move the same correction on the other one. So I'm going to switch here and drag this adjustment layer here. So let me check. Okay, now this is very interesting. And of course I have to fill the mask, the adjustment layer mask with the white. So let me check here what I can do. Now the interesting thing is that the MindtheColor density remembers the same command of the adjustment layer, even if I drag it on a different image. So I can try to fix an image, move the adjustment layer to a different one, make the adjustment, and then I'm done. And this is exactly what I'm going to do here. For example, maybe not so much density, and move a little bit towards the cyan. Okay. And then I need to increase the saturation of the greens here. Maybe move them towards the yellow. No. Okay. Something like this. And as for the skin tone, maybe I can work on the other way. So I can lighten the skin tone by lowering the density. Yes. And then shifting everything towards the yellow. Okay. Now we have more or less the same colors. Maybe I can work on the greens a little bit more. Okay, now here comes the interesting thing. We have worked on these two images thinking about colors in terms of saturation and density. What if I try to convert this kind of images in black and white? How this kind of correction is effective for a black and white conversion? And here comes a very nice surprise, because if I take an adjustment layer, a black and white adjustment layer, you can see here that I have, this is my final version, and this is the original. You can see how different is this image. And again here also, if I take a black and white layer, that's the original and that's the final version. That's before and that's after. And this is the magic of working with subtractive color correction that can change the tonal range, and also I would say the composition, the kind of tonal range we get by thinking about tonal range split into different colors and working on their density. And finally, I would like to show you how MindtheColor density can work on portraits when we have, of course, skin tones like this one. So I'm going to go here and increase the saturation. Now this is very good. That's before and that's after. Now this kind of color is not so far from the skin tone. So what I can do here is not so much, but I can move the density of the reds. And now I have a very nice detail in the hair. I can try also the density, yes, of the yellows. And I can try to move the hue of the skin. Okay, this is too much. Okay, that's before and that's after. Now I'm fine with this version, but what if I try to, I see more or less some gray here, and I try to increase the saturation of the blues. Oh, this is interesting. And what about the cyan? Okay, so that's before and that's after. We have some problems here in the background, and this is due to the low quality of the image because I'm working on a JPEG, an original JPEG. So you can try to see what happens. This happens usually when you push the density too far. Okay, that's before and that's after. Now this is why I tell to people that want to work with subtractive techniques to experiment and not to be afraid to push things too far, because sometimes you can have a very surprising results with this kind of corrections. Again, this is before and this is after. Here we have another case in which we have a very bright image. Let me check the signal here. Okay, I would like to go here and increase the saturation. That's very nice. I guess if we go here to the red and try to increase the density of the red, wow, we have a lot of detail here. Okay, so we can go back with the density inside the skin tone. Now let's take a look before and after, before and after. And you can see how pleasant is the result. I don't think you can do this with the hue saturation or so. Let's have a look. Yes, you can see, and I'm losing detail here when I increase the saturation. If I decrease the lightness, I lose saturation. So it's simply impossible to do the same thing with the usual commands inside Photoshop, because they are very different from the MindtheColor density algorithm. Now here we have a very different image, so we have a very bright tones. So maybe if we increase the saturation, it's going to work, but maybe we will change the look of the image too much. Let's have a try. Okay, now I see that with the skins it's working very well on the hair, so maybe I can try to do this. Okay, definitely too much. And what if I try to do the opposite? Decrease the saturation and increase the density. Let's have a look before and after, before and after. This is interesting. Here we have a kind of red, pink or so, yes. So what if I go into the magenta slider and I try to increase here the saturation? Now that's interesting. I don't know, what about the blue eyes? Okay. So that's before and that's after. Now I can even go further. Okay, this is definitely too much, but now let's have a look before and after. Okay, of course you can always go back and try to recover with the highlights and also maybe with the shadows. So if you want to reduce the effect. That's before and that's after. Now I find this result interesting because this is the opposite way of working. We are not increasing the saturation, we are increasing the density, and this gives to the image a very nice weight and a very strong detail. It looks like a bleach bypass, but it's done in a very different way. And I don't think there is another way of doing this with the usual commands. For example, if I try to use the curves here and I would increase the contrast, you can see how different is the result. Because the curves are working on the full image, so I can try maybe something like selective color, and I can try to, for example, increase the blacks in the yellow. Yes, this goes more or less in the same direction. Okay, this is more or less the same look. Okay, so this is before and this is after. This goes in the same direction of the correction we have done. Now this is MindtheColor density and this is selected color. You can see that we have a less detail here in the hair because MindtheColor density is darkening these areas while keeping these areas bright. And this is definitely a different result. Well, I think now these examples have made the concept of color density, subtractive saturation and correction, and how MindtheColor density allows you to modify an image's look in a completely new way much clearer. The most fascinating aspect I find of this approach to color correction is how the image can radically change its appearance while still maintaining an organic feel that is very similar to cinematic film. Of course, to maximize the potential of these techniques is essential to change your approach to correction by observing the types of colors that make up the image and working on them selectively. Sometimes, as you have seen, images that seem to require tone range optimization can benefit far more from simple adjustments to color, but in terms of saturation and density. No doubt, it's a new way of working, something never seen before in Photoshop. But once you make the mental switch, I believe you will be able to achieve truly exceptional results with your images. Well, now a big thank you to Carlo Diamanti for once again delivering to us a groundbreaking tool for color manipulation. And now it's your turn to unleash the full potential of your images with MindtheColor density.